I'm so honored to be here today to give the Jack W. Provencher Lecture. This is one of those legendary lectures in healthcare ethics. The list of people who've been here before me is a storied list, and it's really amazing to be among you today. One of my major interests in thinking about the moral and ethical dimensions of healthcare ethics is thinking about healthcare work. And I think most of you in the room would identify as people who do or have done healthcare work. Show of hands. How many people? Okay, so that is most of the people in the room. So this is going to be, we're going to talk about very practical issues. We're going to look at conceptual, theological, moral frameworks. But we're going to go back down to the practical, because some of you may be involved in teaching, certainly involved in lifelong learning if you're here today. And this is a topic where the example of senior clinicians really matters to the people who are coming after you and taking over in leadership positions and on the clinical front lines. So it's always an engaging topic, and I hope we'll have a chance for a lot of discussion. So these are just some of the things that I've worked on over the years, in addition to after harm, which is the focus of today's talk, where the central question of this around work is, how should we respond to one another after a person is harmed by someone whose goal was to heal? Not just maliciously or as a consequence of some random encounter, but you hurt someone whom you were trying to heal. So that's the central question that I was trying to answer in After Harm. Another book that I worked on with a lot of other people was How Should We Care for People Who Are Seriously Ill or Nearing the End of Life, something that's very engaged with the actual nature of work in clinical settings. And my most recent book, Our Workarounds Ethical, is really the ideas that developed after I started talking about After Harm, and it was really from the questions, especially from nurses, who were saying, well, how do we manage those moral problems that aren't exactly errors, but could become errors, but could also become good ideas, and they're produced by the conditions of our work. So the After Harm and Our Workarounds Ethical sort of are call and response to each other. And as was mentioned in the introduction, my current research on aging and on immigration overlaps when we consider who does the work of an aging society, who does the care work. I know we're in a blue zone now, so this is definitely something that people at Loma Linda think about. And also, to bring it very much up to date, it's a huge issue in thinking about response to coronavirus. Who does the work? How will work under non-normal conditions? We may be having crisis standards in place that under normal conditions would look like errors. So there's a lot of thinking and a lot of support that has to be done very quickly in hospitals like this and across the nation. But let's start our time together by asking that question. What ought to happen after a person harms another person whom he or she was trying to help? Now, physicians, nurses, and other healthcare professionals may well wonder if the answer to this question includes forgiveness. So after the IOM, now known as the National Academy of Medicine, published its groundbreaking report in 1999 to Err is Human, and it was on the front page of every newspaper, there was a lot of work around patient safety and medical harm focused all over the country. The Hastings Center was part of that as well. And one early piece was published by the wonderful team of Thomas Gallagher and Wendy Levinson. And they were looking at patients' and physicians' attitudes regarding error disclosure. So this is from 2003. So fairly soon after this was very much on the radar screen. So when they were looking at academic and community physicians, they reported that the physicians who were in focus groups, so they were talking to each other. It's a really interesting paper because they're bouncing things off of each other. They experienced powerful emotions following a medical error and felt upset and guilty about harming the patient. They struggled to find support finding a medical error. For many physicians, the most difficult challenge was forgiving themselves for the error. In the opinion of one physician, forgiveness is something I think is tougher for the physician to give themselves than to get from the patient. So how does that sound? Does that, that I see some nodding. So, and it's not as though 17 years magically changes these facts about medical error. And they also found, when they looked at the systems level, that the notion of a blame-free culture of errors, just sort of, having a slogan approach, did not diminish these physicians' anger and anguish and sense of culpability for errors. Better institutional support for caregivers involved in errors would help them focus their attention on the affected patient, because this should be seen as something that is existential. I remember I wrote a paper on this with a doctor at Hopkins, and he said the existential blow of harming a patient is what we are dealing with. There's all of these other things going on, but we have just taken a body blow to our identity. We have done something that feels so wrong to us. Now, Thomas Gallagher and colleagues later went on with Bob Truog and others to write this very helpful book on talking with patients and families about medical error. So focusing on error disclosure and error apology. So it's a nice handbook from Hopkins. And it has a little summary of my book in it. And they said, they got at this moral tension. They said, deciding how to share the facts of the situation avoids speculation, because there's often some sort of investigation going on, while simultaneously managing one's own feelings of guilt, the urge to assign blame. It was the nurse's fault, it was somebody else's fault. And the desire to protect oneself, risk management, is hardly an easy task. Now that's an understatement. But all of this is what's going on in the aftermath of medical harm or suspected medical harm. And again, this is a going concern issue in medicine. So we see that making mistakes and thinking about our mistakes churns up a lot of emotions, including anguish, guilt, and fear. Very unpleasant emotions. So where does ethics come into this mix? And why is forgiveness an ethical issue for physicians and for patients? When I say physicians, a lot of this research is on physicians, but some of this could well involve other members of the healthcare workforce. The physician usually has the responsibility for patient care and often has the disclosure responsibilities. So when I say physician, I don't mean to exclude others, but the doctors tend to be the focus of the research. Now, ethics, including medical ethics, always has a social dimension. We can be moral all by ourselves once we've figured out what we think about right and wrong. There's a brilliant essay by William James where he talks about, he literally says, well, you could be moral all by yourself, but imagine two people alone on a desert island. They would die eventually. It would be a very tragic story, but they would be doing ethics the whole time because it's two people in relation to each other. It's such a wonderful essay. So we are ethical or unethical once we start doing things that affect others. It's about behavior. The value exposed in the familiar principle, do no harm, concerns our actions with respect to persons and others other than ourselves, external to ourselves, in particular with respect to people who are ill, because of the foundational duty in healthcare work to that person. Ethics is, of course, more than the rules of good professional conduct, certainly more than codes of ethics. It involves close attention to the emotions present in an ethically challenging situation, including the physician's own emotions. Research on cognitive science keeps pointing out that our emotions are part of our reasoning. We get to our emotions before we get to our reasons. In the aftermath of medical harm, ethical practice includes the care of injured patients and their families through practices such as truth-telling, apology, and fair compensation. These practices are likely to involve the physician responsible for the patient's care at the time of the injury, even if responsibility for care was subsequently transferred. They may involve other professionals and administrators as well. So fair compensation almost always is going to involve risk management. There's a large literature on the psychological impact of caring for patients that suggests that physicians' emotions concerning a range of different type of bad outcomes, such as the experience of being fired by a patient or family, should be recognized. And I'll talk a bit about that later. So it isn't just, I hurt someone. It could be, somebody thought I wasn't good enough and doesn't want me in the room anymore. There's a study that I'll mention by palliative care doctors saying, wait, we're supposed to be the good communicators, and this patient has just ordered me out of the room. What am I, So the ethical dimensions of medical harm therefore includes how the involved physician recovers from such incidents and goes back to practice, because the person who's been shaken by that existential blow is still a patient, is still a physician. physician, is still a nurse, is still in relationship to healthcare. Now, this recovery process may include the desire for forgiveness. This is a word that has two contradictory meanings. We're accustomed to forgiving loved ones after minor or major arguments. In these cases, forgiveness tends to mean reconciliation, or it may just mean we're going to get along until the next argument. We have a traditional argument at Thanksgiving, and then we patch it up and we go along. And I think most people in families are familiar with this kind of situation. But we also may forgive a loan to a family member. The library may forgive our fees on overdue books in order to get them back and to get us back into relationship with the library. In these cases, forgiveness is understood to mean detachment, an end to a debt or other obligation between two parties. When we speak about forgiveness after medical harm, which kind of forgiveness do we mean? It's not a simple question. The kind that brings people together, or the kind that allows them to detach from each other and go on with their separate lives? When does forgiveness repair a relationship to working order so it can keep working? When does it restore a relationship that's been shattered and may never be the same? It's still going to have cracks in it. When does it resolve a relationship by ending it in a mutually acceptable way? And these are important questions for medicine because medical harm occurs in different types of healthcare relationships. How does forgiveness work in the relationship between a patient and a primary care practitioner? You have this awesome FQHC right here at Loma Linda. So you have lots of doctors who have ongoing relationships with patients to preserve health. How does it work in the relationship between a hospitalized patient and the members of the team who are maybe caring for them during a particular shift, but there's no ongoing relationship of my doctor, my nurse? Or between a patient and a surgical specialist who they never really meet or may have met under anesthesia conditions. How do you forgive a system for a system's error, since that is always a piece of medical harm in complex systems? And what about self-forgiveness? Does that count? What is the nature of self-forgiveness in relation to the harmed other? So first, let's look at the sources of some of our ideas about forgiveness, because how a culture frames the human potential for error influences how a person shaped by a culture thinks about forgiveness as a possible response to human error. The other response could be litigation. It could be the idea of continuing to fight the situation. But I don't want to suggest that legal solutions or compensation are in any way incompatible with forgiveness. So this is the part where I mispronounce Hebrew, and there will probably be people in the room who are much better at this. So in the Hebrew Bible, the word chata is the word for missing the mark. It appears 595 times, more than 4 times more often than its synonym. It is often translated, whether into Latin or into English or into another language, as though it's just sin, as though that's the term. But when you talk to Hebrew scholars, they say, no, it means missing the mark. It means that there was a target in mind and you missed, or a traveler who took the wrong turn, or the physician who ordered the wrong drug, or the pharmacist or nurse who didn't catch the mistake in the order. The knowledge is there, the skill is there, the intent is there, the action doesn't go as planned. The experience of making a medical mistake can feel like the experience of missing the mark. So that's why I lift up this metaphor, because it seems to resonate in the medical context. However, the same incident of missing the mark, let's imagine a harmful medication error, may be framed in different ways by different cultures. The culture of medicine may call this a technical error. Risk management may say, oh, potential claim, better open a file on that one. Patient safety may say systems failure. A patient's family or a harmed patient may say, this is an injury to us, this is a body blow to us with medical, financial, and psychological consequences that may extend for the rest of our lives. And for the clinicians involved, it may be a psychologically and professionally traumatic event. It may well be traumatic to the patient and family as well, but it may be experienced as a traumatic event. By appreciating the different ways in which the same incident can be framed, we can see how expectations of each party concerning the resolution of such cases are likely to differ. So how does the harmed party forgive the person or the system who has missed the mark, resulting in harm? Jewish traditions concerning forgiveness emphasize concrete interpersonal obligations. Kapara, a Hebrew word associated with rituals of atonement, refers to the reconciliation of the person who has committed the error with the person he or she has injured. These rituals are enacted by the observant at each year prior to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Kippur and Kapara have the same root. Within the Jewish tradition and the Christian traditions that followed from it, forgiveness can be seen as a response to two discrete actions or series of actions: an acknowledgement of the error by the person who has made it, a practice that might be called confession or disclosure, and an effort by this person to make amends for the harm he or she has done. The practice or practices often called repentance or atonement. Forgiveness is the outcome of this relational ethical process. So, my little chart. Error leads to confession, truth-telling, and apology is how we would understand that here. Repentance, the need for, is the atonement, the response to the concrete needs of the harmed party, maybe by compensation. Those create the conditions for forgiveness by the harmed party. They don't trigger it. They don't demand it. So the process set in motion by the discovery that what has happened should not have happened. Truth-telling and apology are forms of confession and fair compensation, and also the analysis and changes in how work will be performed are forms of repentance and atonement. These may be important to the harmed party to know that there's effort going on to make sure this doesn't happen again, to make sure there is learning, but they are not always going to speak directly to the circumstances, the material circumstances of that patient or family. Now, Jewish and Christian traditions around error and forgiveness are powerful, if not always acknowledged, influences on Western culture and Western medicine. The practices that medical sociologist Charles Bosk of University of Pennsylvania described in Forgive and Remember, his classic study from 1979 and still in print, a study of surgical residents and the surgical M&M, Mortality and Morbidity Conference, are clearly based on religious sources. There is confession through the self-critical hair shirt ritual of publicly describing the incident to one's peers and supervisors. There are acts of repentance through assigned tasks and close supervision, and there is official forgiveness by a senior surgeon who functions as deity, high priest, judge, pastor, peer group representative, and injured party. The injured party, the patient or the loved ones of a deceased patient, is excluded from this ritual. M&M is closed. Yet patients and families also have ritual needs and expectations in the aftermath of medical harm. A well-designed disclosure process should take these needs and expectations into account and should learn how to do so by talking with patients and families about their experiences, good and bad. We often in healthcare have gotten into the habit of asking, sort of soliciting compliments like good reviews, rate me, or, even when my father was in the hospital once, I complimented somebody for something they'd done and they said, oh, well, you could write us a note about that. I'm thinking, okay, that has sort of killed my desire to do that, but thank you. But we have to remember that it's not always a complaint when we talk to a patient about something that didn't go well. It also means we are hearing them, and it's an opportunity for learning, for getting a perspective that we did not know about. In the Jewish and Christian biblical traditions, the deepest meaning of forgiveness is detachment, not being bound by our errors. The metaphor associated with forgiveness is the cancellation of a financial debt that can never be repaid. You hear this in the Lord's Prayer, and reflects a culture in which debt servitude was common. Yet the idea of forgiveness as reconciliation may be closely associated with these traditions too. Patients and healthcare professionals alike may base their ideas about what good people are supposed to do, moral people, after one person harms one another on lessons they learned as children, whether these were conveyed in the terms of religious beliefs and practices or simply as good manners. As one person who was a part of our Hastings Center research said, you mess up, you fess up. This is what you could teach a child. In the aftermath of medical harm, individuals who hold these values may be unsure whether their goal should be the reconciliation of persons. Becoming free from the error itself as a source of continued suffering may be an appropriate goal, whether or not individual persons wish to be reconciled. You may say, I want to be able to go on with my life. I don't necessarily feel that you and I have to be in a relationship forever. But influential traditions are not universal norms. Not everyone uses the same metaphors or thinks about human relationships in the same way. For example, forgiveness as a metaphor for relationship between individuals may not make much sense in religious traditions in which a concept of the self as independent from other persons is not the norm. In traditions such as Buddhism, in which suffering is recognized as an inevitable feature of human existence, compassion, literally suffering with, may be the most common metaphor for the repair of damaged relationships. In a culturally diverse society like ours, where the physician population and the patient population may have been shaped by a variety of religious and cultural experiences, we should recognize the sources of medicine's common metaphors and expectations. And we should recognize that metaphors and expectations of individual clinicians and individual patients may derive from different sources. I think of this as the everyone does not have the same grandmother in sight. You know, there's the culture of medicine, and then there is where we get our own ways of relating. I remember when I was working on this, we had a visiting scholar at the Hastings Center who was a Japanese cardiologist, and she said, well, don't imagine that if someone harms you and you're a Buddhist, it's easy to be compassionate. I mean, suffering with is not simple. So there's no other simple solution. We can't really reach into another culture to say, oh, they've solved this really well. That existential blow is a reality in anywhere I've ever spoken anywhere in the world. So let's consider whether forgiveness is good for us, as popular articles often suggest. Research by some clinical psychologists and social scientists suggests that the ability to forgive may be characteristic of an emotionally healthy person, while a refusal to forgive may associate with behaviors ranging from holding grudges to perpetuating conflicts on larger scales. Other scholars and clinicians have criticized efforts to prescribe forgiveness as a therapeutic intervention, saying, for example, after abuse, arguing that these efforts fail to recognize forgiveness as an individual's personal response to the experience of being harmed. As American legal scholar Martha Minow points out, fundamentally, forgiveness cannot be commanded. Now, the idea that forgiveness, or at least not holding grudges, is good for us is an attractive idea in our culture because we don't tend to think well of a person who, is a grudge bearer. So let's try out these ideas and see if they work in a context in which someone who expected to be helped has been harmed. The classic, the patient encounter. Right away, there's a problem. If we identify forgiveness as characteristic of an emotionally healthy person, does that mean that an injured person, an injured patient, is an unhealthy person who is willfully holding a grudge if he or she does not offer forgiveness? The frequent characterization of harmed patients as angry patients or of their families as difficult or demanding reflects a still common failure to acknowledge two things: that anger is an appropriate response to this situation, and that the person who is accountable for making things right after harm is not the same as the person who's been harmed. The patient's job is not to make you feel better. This confusion also plays out at the organizational level when a hospital characterizes itself as blame-free but fails to explain how this helps patients. Will this culture dismiss patients and families who seek explanations or compensation as troublemakers looking for someone to blame? There's a further problem with prescribing forgiveness broadly as an intervention. As human beings, we may be reluctant to say, "I forgive you," if we believe we are merely excusing bad behavior rather than responding to changed behavior. Psychologists call the pressure to offer forgiveness prematurely pseudo-forgiveness. Some have suggested that therapeutic interventions that aim to produce forgiveness are unsound in that they place responsibility for the resolution of harm on the harmed party, who may also be the less powerful party. The person who feels pressured to offer pseudo-forgiveness may still get angry, and they may eventually file a lawsuit. So the discovery of a harmful mistake leads directly to the words, "I'm sorry." But the words, "I'm sorry," do not lead directly to the words, "I forgive you." This is not solely a matter of the right words. So now what about self-forgiveness? Forgiving oneself for harming a patient is not at all the same thing as making it possible for this patient to choose to offer forgiveness to you. However, a physician, through his or her own actions, who supports the ability of a patient to forgive, may also need to practice self-forgiveness so he or she is able to get back to work, literally to touch a patient again. But what does self-forgiveness mean beyond an intuitive sense of wanting to be free of the burden of guilt? Now, Boston University philosopher Charles Griswold rightly distinguishes between forgiveness, which can be granted only by the injured party, and self-forgiveness. And he's written a wonderful moral philosophy of forgiveness. In self-forgiveness, according to Griswold, the injury that one has done to oneself precisely in injuring another is the catalyst for confessing to oneself, acknowledging that you did it. So if the discovery of the mistake leads directly to the words, "I'm sorry," the discovery of the harm also initiates a parallel process that can lead to self-forgiveness as the physician grapples with the existential blow of having harmed a patient. So you have to tell the truth to someone else, and you have to tell the truth to yourself. Jeffrey Bluestein, who's a philosopher and a bioethicist at City University of New York, argues that self-forgiveness, like forgiveness, is a feature of taking responsibility for one's past. In Bluestein's view, the past should not be reduced to a checklist of what one has done and what one has failed to do, but should be viewed in psychological or narrative terms. What one has shown oneself to be like by what one has done. In our own past, as we understand it, our own past should be accessible and useful to us as a way for understanding moral and ethical challenges. Physicians are accustomed to drawing on years of clinical training and experience. If we are unable to forgive ourselves for something in our past, there will be a break in our own story as we know it. We are going to have difficulty understanding the content of our own character. We may have difficulty anticipating how well we will respond to a similar situation in the future. We might just dread that will happen again. Bluestein reminds us that any genuine process of forgiveness is not automatic. Self-forgiveness, like the forgiveness of others, is ordinarily a process that has to be gone through. It's not something you can just, do a quick, rapid response and then, okay, get back out there. It takes time and often not a little effort to suppress or forgo one's self-directed negative feelings. One cannot forgive oneself for what one has done if one is not prepared to take responsibility for it. And the explanation of the failure to take responsibility for some problematic part of one's past might be that one cannot or will not forgive oneself about it. So I imagine like this sense of error and shame and guilt becomes sort of encapsulated, but it stays in you. And then you just keep pushing it out and blaming other people for it. So what do we make? This is a really tough philosophical account. On the one hand, a person who is not self-forgiving is refusing to acknowledge his or own human fallibility. I did it. Or else views himself or herself as a moral monster. I'm just outside, beyond the pale. I'm dirty forever. Neither of these is a trustworthy position from which to move forward and to help others, something medical professionals have to be able to do. On the other hand, reducing self-forgiveness to a mere affirmation, it's a new day, turn the page, which we all do, in life, would mean that the physician is skipping the hard work of figuring out exactly what he or she is on the hook for. And that doesn't bode well for the safety of future patients. And again, I'm saying physicians here because that is where most of the literature is. But this could apply to any other healthcare professional and indeed to people. If we're human, we've grappled with these questions. So the process of self-forgiveness is likely to be a long and messy one, as the physician wrestles with his or her own emotions and sense of responsibility concerning their own actions, and also perhaps wrestles with emotions directed toward others involved in error. These are examples that people have mentioned to me after I've given talks like this. Why didn't that pharmacist catch that mistake in my order? Why didn't that nurse stand up to me if she noticed the mistake? Do they share responsibility for this harm, or is it all on me? Would I have listened to them or not? And how can I talk with them about this, mindful of the differences in our status, so we can continue to work together? In the same essay by Jeffrey Bluestein, he writes that self-reproach makes sense only for something over which someone has some control. So this gets us into the philosophical idea of moral luck, which is a really fascinating idea. To what extent should we as individuals be praised or blamed for things that happen? They just happen. They're chance in some ways. Separating one's emotional response to a distressing situation, what happened to that patient on our watch was terrible, means we also have to think of, well, what happened was terrible, and I did have some control over what happened, but how much control did I really have? So sometimes when we say, I feel terrible about something, you say, do I feel about the situation because it's inherently tragic? Or do I feel bad about it because I had an opportunity to do some specific good or prevent some specific harm and I blew it? Self-forgiveness can be especially complicated when it's not clear that a patient has been harmed by action or inaction, but there's a sense that something could have gone better. In their article on being fired, which I mentioned earlier, 4 specialists in palliative care argued that palliative care clinicians may be at greater risk than other medical clinicians of being rejected by patients. Let's imagine this very common scenario. The patient who is referred to palliative care near the end of a terminal disease is often psychologically distressed and physically exhausted. They may reject the offer to build yet another relationship with yet another physician and team. Or the patient may initially accept palliative care, but then project his or her own distress onto palliative care professionals, breaking off relationships because, quote, you're making me feel bad, or you always want to talk about death every time you walk into the room. Some patients may fire palliative care as a means of asserting some control. As the authors write, pushing us away allows the patient to feel less close to death. Being fired is personally painful and can induce feelings of guilt and shame, as the fired professional wonders, how can this have happened to me? Am I any good at this or not? What do my colleagues think of me now? This professional may struggle to figure out how much of the situation was under his or her control. Talking things over with colleagues who are familiar with the psychology of suffering and dying may help this colleague both to understand his or her feelings and also to figure out if there were missed opportunities. Is this just part of the job, or did I make a mistake in how I sought to help that patient? Figuring out what an individual clinician controls is complicated because medical mistakes inevitably happen inside of complex systems. Richard Cook, an anesthesiologist at the University of Chicago, who studies systems such as healthcare that are intrinsically hazardous and possess potential for catastrophic failure, points out that working in such a system requires intimate contact with failure. That is, the physician or other workers should be able to imagine how a tolerably safe situation, people in patient safety call this the envelope. So you imagine an envelope that has one side open, and that's where the error can come in. Everything else is, oh, these are the good choices, and then there's this potential for a bad outcome. So you're always trying to keep things away from the outside, that open edge of the envelope. But sometimes, as we know, things do slip in that direction. So what should physicians do in the aftermath of medical harm with respect to forgiveness? What helps the injured party, and what helps the physician recover from this incident? Well, the physician should not expect to hear the words, I forgive you, from an injured patient or family, even after disclosure, apology, and assistance in securing fair compensation. Asking for forgiveness may be oppressive to a patient or family still grappling with the fact of the harm, the impact of the harm, and their own emotional responses to the harm. Asking them during a time of crisis and even bereavement to offer a premature formulaic response is simply too much to ask. The process of forgiveness may be the work of months or years. At the same time, however, the physician can work towards self-forgiveness by taking responsibility for his or her past, by working to understand his or her own role in an incident that slipped beyond that envelope of safety, and by responding to the needs that have been created as the result of harm. If we value forgiveness as a desirable and authentically human response to human error in medicine, we must create the conditions that will help those who have been harmed to offer forgiveness, and in so doing, we will also help those whose actions have caused harm to be restored as healers. So I'll wrap up with 2 memories. I once gave this talk in San Antonio on election night in 2008. That was a very memorable night, even in Texas. Before the talk, I took a walk around downtown, and that was early November, so it was during the Days of the Dead festival. And I came across 5 neighborhood ofrendas, altars with offerings to dead loved ones, and maybe those are common in Southern California as well. On one altar, there was a can of hairspray. That was an important part of the life of the person who was being honored. On another, there was a bowl of kibble for a cat named Callie who lived at a school. They were just everywhere. It was the greatest thing. And I began to think about how talking about medical mistakes openly, often in the aftermath of tragedy, are ofrendas. They are offerings to the dead as rituals of mourning and commemoration, in addition to opportunities for learning and innovation. We must always keep the human story, the connection to real lives in mind. My colleague at Denver Health, Lilia Cervantes, who's a pioneer in healthcare for undocumented immigrants, has drawn my attention to the use of ofrendas in California to commemorate the lives of undocumented immigrants who died due to lack of access to health care. There are some photos of that that one can find, but it's, again, people have made use of that tradition to talk about a large-scale system and moral failure. And way back in the day, I gave a very early version of this talk at a medical grand rounds at a hospital in Pennsylvania. And grand rounds were at lunch, and they provided lunch, so there was good attendance. And the residents were not sleeping as they do in early morning rounds, they were eating. And after the discussion, one of the residents came running down the aisle. He was so happy, and he said, "I had Chinese for lunch. This was my fortune cookie. I wanted you to have it." So, love the truth and forgive error. And there's soy sauce on it, as you can see. So I thought that was very sweet, so I commemorated it in my slides. Some further readings on the topic, the Bluestein and Richard Cook and others that might be of interest. Also, I should mention that this is the Hastings Center. We are located in Garrison, New York, in a former country house that then was a school, so that's the idyllic setting. That is our view of the Hudson River. If you pivoted slightly to your left, you would see West Point, which is directly across the river from us, and we have a visiting scholar program. So we have scholars of all ages. About 75% are early career scholars. Many are practitioners. There is a very international group, and we welcome inquiries. And if you have any questions about that, I'm the director of the Visiting Scholar Program, so happy to talk. So thank you.